Is your medication helping or hurting you? Find out at drugsafetynews.com.
DuPont is one of the longest operating companies in the United States. They're also one of the most dangerous. For decades, and maybe even longer than that, the company has been dumping poisonous toxins into the environment, and these toxins then make their way into the bodies of human beings and animals, causing life-threatening conditions that may never go away. And when they phase out one toxic chemical, they replace it with something just as deadly, and that's exactly what's happening right now with the company. Joining me to explain what's happening is Sharon Lerner, an investigative journalist who's chronicling DuPont's deception for The Intercept. Sharon, you've done some phenomenal work covering the C8 story with DuPont. And now your latest set for The Intercept is talking about a new chemical that DuPont has used to replace C8, has some serious problems. But before we get into that, take us really quickly back down the road of C8 and give everybody a quick primer on that particular chemical.
Okay, so C8, which is called that because it's a perfluorinated compound, which it's a chain of 8 carbons with fluorines attached to it. It's a very stable compound, which has been incredibly useful in industry. It was made initially by 3M, which sold a huge quantity of it to DuPont, which used it for years and years to make Teflon and then many, many other products. Now, over those years, starting the early 50s, the company began to learn more and more about the chemical, and primarily the things of concern that it learned was that it was harmful to lab animals in various ways. And also they realized it was spreading into the environment outside their main plant that produced it, which was in West Virginia, into the water there and through the air, through the soil, also in New Jersey around a plant it had there. And the reason that the stories that I wrote and then some other stories have come out about it was because it became a huge legal issue. And as you mentioned earlier, there are now thousands of pending cases against DuPont. Because we learned eventually, the public learned, though DuPont had known for years before, that it was in fact dangerous. And what we learned from something called the C8 Health Project and the C8 Science Panel was that in large populations, you could see that this chemical had health effects. And namely, there are 6 main conditions that it was linked to, 2 of them being testicular cancer and kidney cancer. So it was a huge legal issue and a huge dawning realization for folks, both those living in the area and then really for everyone, because this is now a chemical that is in the blood of virtually everyone at this point because it is so widely used in industry.
And reports have shown that even polar bears up in the Arctic are showing signs of C8 in their blood. I mean that's how widespread and biopersistent this toxin truly is. And so that's the story of C8 in a nutshell, really. And so now DuPont says, okay, well, several years ago they said, okay, look, we're going to kind of phase out C8. We're going to bring in this new compound. It's going to be so much healthier for the environment. It's not going to harm people the way that C8 did. And this chemical they're calling Gen X. You've just written a great piece on Gen X. Tell us about this one.
Thank you. So Gen X was the compound that DuPont introduced to replace C8. So we should say that there was a voluntary phase out of C8 sort of done between DuPont, several other companies that used and made it, and the EPA around 2006 was when they sort of struck the agreement. And by last year, 2015, nobody was supposed to use a fluorinated chemical that had 8 carbons or more. So that was it for C8. But as they were phasing it out, DuPont was phasing in another chemical. And that chemical, the product you named as Gen X, is based on a 6-carbon molecule. And it turns out, as you mentioned, that they're promoting it as a healthier, more sustainable chemical. But it turns out that it causes many of the same health effects in lab animals that we saw with C8. There's one way in which C6 is an improvement, a clearly improvement that as I understand it, and that is that it stays in humans' blood for longer. It's less biopersistent. In pretty much every other way, it seems to be just as bad. It never breaks down. So we're talking about geologic time. It will likely be present on Earth long after humans are gone from it. And as I mentioned, it does the same thing to animals that we saw with C8. And I know this because I found the 8E reports, which are reports that the company is required to submit to the EPA when they see a substantial risk of harm to the human health or the environment. And we found a big number of these, and they were basically reports from DuPont of their own experiments on C6, and some of them showed that they cause similar tumors in rats that we saw with C8. Again, they also cause kidney and liver problems, same kind of things we saw with C8. I've shared those documents with toxicologists and other scientists who are familiar with C8 and have done work on the health effects of C8 because it looked the same to me, but I'm not a toxicologist. So I shared it with those experts, and they said to me what I suspected, that it looks like exactly the same thing all over again. And I should say, the one way in which it's improvement, it doesn't last in your blood as long. I've spoken with experts on the chemical who said, well, that doesn't necessarily mitigate the harm, because as we are making more and more of this stuff and it becomes more present in the environment, we continue to be exposed to it. So even though your body will clear it in, days or months instead of years, if you are continually ingesting it and breathing it, then you're still exposed to it, and that sort of negates that benefit that they're talking about.
And so, the company in its own reports has shown that this new Gen-X chemical can be just as dangerous as C8. It is causing cancer in lab rats, liver cancers and other tumors, pancreas, testicular cancer and tumors. So do they have any plans at this point to phase out Gen-X and maybe bring in something that's not as deadly? Or is this just the new standard? This is their new cancer-causing chemical?
So we should say that, that they we're talking about now is no longer DuPont, because DuPont spun off its fluorochemicals business to another company now called Chemours, which rhymes with Dinamores. It's still sort of the baby of DuPont. But anyway, so they even though they didn't develop it, this is now their product. Is it the standard? Yeah, this is their product. The process of getting rid of, and we should, let me note here, I was going to say getting rid of C8, but we should remember that the EPA never banned C8. It was a voluntary agreement, right? So we never had any binding regulation with C8. So we can't really, even though it's popping up all over the country now, right? It's in all these water systems, and we've done reporting on how, C8 and other chemicals are around military bases, and it's in so many places, but you can't sue anyone to get it out of the water because it's not regulated yet, right? So, that process to get to just the voluntary phase out took decades. Right? It took, the lawsuit, the legal action began in 1999, but just sort of all the lead up in terms of accumulating the science and kind of the very, very slow dawning of the realization that it was a problem took many, many years. So now this is an entirely different chemical, right? So we're at the very beginning, and we're at the beginning of the health research. We're at the beginning of any awareness. I mean, I really don't think there is any awareness. And so given that C8 isn't regulated, the chances that C6 are regulated are even smaller, and they're going to be longer in coming.
And so, as you've said, there's no real, regulation. None of this is particularly banned. With C8, we saw the disposal process is what led to a lot of the contamination, because they were allowed to dump this in the Ohio River, I believe, where it got into the drinking water. With this C6, this Gen X, is the dumping process the same, or is there at least some process of safe dumping where they're barreling it up and putting it where it can never leach out, or what's happening with this?
So the chemical was the subject of a consent order, which means that when DuPont submitted it to the EPA, and they have to at least announce that they're putting on a new chemical. And I should say that in my reporting from the C8 reporting, when they were kind of negotiating a phase out with the EPA, one of the things they said was, they were kind of calling the shots in many ways. And they said, we want to make sure that we have a smooth entrance for our replacement. That was one of the terms that they came up with. So in any case, C6 was subject to a consent order, and the consent order said, among other things, that you have to do this research. Part of the research that they required is what ended up in those 80 reports that I found. The interesting thing is that once you get those 80 reports, like presumably you're requiring the research because then if it shows something bad, then something else happens. But in this case, it seems what happened was they required this and they found this stuff and it got filed away. And one of the folks I spoke with at the EPA actually acknowledged, she said, yeah, these things often get filed away. But in response to your question, is there a new disposal process? One of the things they said was that, yes, the company had to limit its releases and capture, what it was a good percentage of what it would be emitting. It's very hard to check up on any of that. And that's one of the things I was trying to show with one of the two pieces that just came out. Because, for the most part, nobody even knew the chemical makeup of the replacement. So how do you check on whether they're emitting it if you don't know what it is?
All right. Well, Sharon, you've done great work on this. Everyone needs to go to The Intercept and check all this out. We will have a link to it on our site. Sharon, thank you for talking with us today, and keep up the great work. We will check back in with you, as often as possible, because this is information that everybody who's watching this program, who's reading these stories online, we have to know it, and we have to share it, and we have to get this out there. So thank you very much for everything you have done.
Thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.